The rain came sideways that night, not the gentle desert kind that washes the creosote clean and leaves the air tasting of something ancient and renewed. This was an angry rain, the kind that arrives from the mountains without warning, driving hard across the valley floor, turning parking lot asphalt into black mirrors that reflect nothing clearly. The kind of rain that makes people move fast, heads down, too focused on their own comfort to notice what is happening 20 feet away. Margaret Harlan did not move fast anymore. She was 78 years old, and her knees had long since formed their own opinions about pace. She walked the way women her age learned to walk, carefully, deliberately, one hand always within reach of something solid in case the ground decided to be untrustworthy. She had parked in her usual spot that evening, third row from the western entrance, next to the concrete pillar, because the pillar gave her something to hold if the surface was slick. 15 years she had been coming to this particular Walmart on Wednesday evenings. 15 years of the same routine, the same parking spot, the same cashier on register 4, who always asked about her tomato garden and never forgot whether the plants were doing well or struggling. She should have been at her car. Groceries in the trunk, seatbelt buckled, radio tuned to the oldies station she privately knew every word to. She should have been 3 minutes from home. Instead, she stood very still in the rain with a young man's hand around her throat. His name was Brant Stowe, though she did not yet know that in full. She knew him as the young man with the expensive car, the one who had first appeared 6 weeks ago, with his BMW keys swinging from one finger, like a metronome keeping time to music she could not hear. The one with the smile that lived entirely on the surface of his face and never went any deeper. His hand was not squeezing hard enough to cut off her air completely. Not yet. It was a hand that knew precisely how much pressure to apply to make a 78-year-old woman understand something very specific without leaving marks that any reasonable person could photograph in good lighting. Her grocery bags lay scattered on the wet asphalt. A carton of eggs she would never cook into Sunday breakfast. A loaf of bread darkening through its plastic. The small bunch of yellow tulips she allowed herself on Wednesdays because small luxuries on ordinary days were something her mother had taught her to value, and she had never stopped. The flowers floated in a puddle near the rear tire of her car. She could hear the rain on the roof of the store behind her. She could hear the distant mechanical sound of a shopping cart being collected somewhere in the empty dark of the lot. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was steadier than the situation seemed to warrant, and she found this interesting in a detached way that she recognized as the particular clarity that arrives when the ordinary options disappear. She had been afraid before. Real fear, the 2 in the morning variety, when the phone rings and you know before you answer it that the world has changed shape. She had learned over 78 years that real fear does not panic. Real fear goes quiet and starts thinking. She was thinking now. Her hand moved toward the pocket of her raincoat. Carefully, without drama, the way you move when you do not want the movement noticed. Her fingers found the phone. Brant leaned close enough that she could see the rain beating on his face, see the specific quality of blankness in his expression that was more frightening than anger would have been. Anger wants something it can name. Anger negotiates. This was something else. This was a young man who had made a decision and was waiting for the outcome to confirm it. "You should have taken the money," he said, 8 weeks ago. Would have been simple. She said nothing. Her thumb found the contact she needed without looking. The last number in her recent calls. She pressed it. 1 ring. 2 rings. Brant's grip adjusted. 3 rings. Then a pause. Then a voice that arrived through the speaker, the way certain voices arrive without preamble or softening, direct as weather. A voice that had once given commands in desert heat and had those commands followed without question. A voice that had learned over 6 decades how to carry authority without raising it. "Mom," she said the name quietly. "Sloan," she said, "I need you." 2 seconds of silence. In those 2 seconds, a 62-year-old woman in a garage in Flagstaff, Arizona set down what she was holding, straightened to her full height, and became a particular version of herself that most people only saw when circumstances made it necessary. "Where are you, Winnicum?" "Walmart." The one on Brant reached down and took the phone from her hand. He did not grab it violently. He removed it with the casual certainty of someone accustomed to taking things from people who had no practical recourse. He looked at the cracked screen. He looked at the call, still connected, the seconds still counting. He smiled. He threw the phone across the wet pavement. It skittered nearly 20 feet and came to rest face up, still glowing. The call still open, still carrying every sound in that parking lot to a woman in Flagstaff who was already reaching for her keys, already moving toward the door, already running through the distance and the variables with the automatic efficiency of someone whose mind had been trained to calculate those things quickly and accurately. Hold that image. The rain, the scattered flowers, the old woman standing very straight in spite of everything, the phone face up on wet asphalt like a small and stubborn light. Hold it, because this story did not begin here. Stories that look like they begin in parking lots in rain with a hand on someone's throat never actually begin there. They begin earlier in quieter moments in the choices made when nobody is watching, when nothing is at stake, yet when life is asking questions that won't be understood as questions until years later. This story began 6 weeks before that night, and to understand it properly, you need to understand the woman who picked up those keys. Sloan Harlan was 62 years old in the way that a particular kind of person is 62, fully and without apology, every year of it present and accounted for in the lines of her face and the set of her shoulders and the way she occupied whatever space she was standing in. She was not tall, 5'7", but she had the posture of someone taller, the posture of someone who had long ago stopped making herself smaller for rooms that expected it. Her hair was silver, cut short and practical, the same way she had worn it since her early 40s, when she had stopped pretending she had time for anything else. There was a scar along her left forearm, pale against weathered skin, earned not in combat, but in a garage accident 11 years ago, that she had never bothered to have looked at properly until it was well past the window for proper treatment. She was the president of the Iron Road Motorcycle Club Flagstaff chapter, which she had run for 9 years and which comprised 22 members. All of them veterans, all of them people who had come back from somewhere difficult and found in the club a form of continuity that civilian life had not naturally provided. She had served 2 tours in Iraq as a military police officer, 1 tour in Afghanistan as part of a special investigations unit that she did not discuss in detail, and had been decorated 3 times twice for actions she described when pressed as doing what the situation required, and once for an act of sustained courage under fire that the citation described at considerably more length and that she had never read aloud to anyone. She ran Ironworks Garage on the eastern edge of Flagstaff, a steel and concrete building that looked from the outside like a person's entire personality expressed in tools and motor oil. Inside it was something else. Clean in the way working spaces become clean when maintained by someone who understands that order is a form of respect for the machines, for the craft, for the people who entrust you with the things they care about. The garage had been her late wife's idea. Dana had come home with her from the second tour, had watched Sloan spend 6 weeks sitting on the porch at all hours staring at the middle distance, and had said with the directness that had been one of the things Sloan had loved most about her, that hands needed to be busy, and that idle hands in Sloan's particular case were nobody's friend. She had found the building, she had handled the financing, she had painted the sign out front herself standing on a ladder in October sunlight, and had called down to Sloan standing below, "You had better be worth this." Sloan had spent 15 years trying to be worth it. Dana had been gone for 7 years now. A cancer that arrived without warning and progressed with the indifference of things that do not care about the plans they interrupt. She had died in the spring, which Sloan had found particularly unfair, because Dana had loved springs. The garage was still standing. The sign was still there, slightly weathered now. The letters Dana had painted still legible, but softened by years of Arizona sun into something that looked less like signage and more like memory made permanent. There was a legal dispute over the property. Dana's brother, who had never visited the garage while Dana was alive and had visited 3 times in the year following the death, had filed a claim to partial ownership based on a document that Sloan's attorney described as inventive and that a judge had so far declined to rule on with any finality. The dispute was ongoing. It required Sloan to maintain a profile that did not invite additional scrutiny, to be as much as possible a person about whom no one felt the need to make phone calls. This had never been her most natural state. Every morning began with the same ritual. Coffee black, standing at the workbench rather than sitting, because sitting first thing felt like conceding something to the day before it had proven it deserved the concession. Then the box on the shelf. Inside the box, her father's service pistol, a 1911 carried through Korea, and brought home with a scratch on the grip that the old man had explained once, and only once, in the particular way that men of his generation explained certain things briefly with the clear expectation that once would be sufficient. She would take the pistol out, check it clean, it with the automatic movements of someone for whom the action had become less about maintenance and more about the mental state that the action produced, then return it to the box and not think about it again until morning. She had not fired it in 12 years. The box sat on its shelf every day like a question that had already been answered. The answer was no. The answer was she had made promises. To Donna in the months before the end, when they had talked about what came after with the particular honesty that dying makes possible. To Tommy Hale 20 years ago in the desert outside Mosul with burning metal 30 feet away and the smell of everything terrible surrounding them. She had made promises, and she was among the many things she was a woman who kept them. She had come home. She had built something. She was keeping quiet. She was keeping quiet right up until the Tuesday night her mother called the shop because Maggie never called the shop. She had the cell number, and the fact of calling the shop told Sloan everything about the seriousness of it before a word was said. The way Maggie opened, "I need you to promise me you won't do anything stupid." That phrase from that woman was the equivalent of a smoke signal visible for 50 miles. Margaret Harlan had raised her daughter alone from the age of 14 when Sloane's father died at his workbench of a heart attack so sudden and complete that the doctor said he never knew it was coming, which Maggie had decided to treat as a mercy, and Sloane had decided she did not have the right to argue with. She had worked 2 jobs for 4 years to keep the house reliably fed and the lights reliably on. She had driven Sloane to the Army recruiting station on her 18th birthday with the expression of someone doing something that cost them considerably but cost the other person more not to do. She had called every week for both deployments, kept the calls short so Sloane would not worry about the phone bills, always ended with "stay low, come home." She was not a woman who asked for help easily. The fact that she was asking now meant she had run out of other options. Sloane listened to the story of Brant Stowe in the 6 weeks of parking lot encounters. The claim about the scraped BMW, the insurance companies finding that there was nothing worth pursuing, Brant's reappearance, the escalating demands $5,000, $7,009, the bruises on her mother's wrist, finger-shaped, documented in the past tense in the way Maggie documented things she did not want to have to revisit emotionally. "Did you call the police?" 3 weeks ago. "They took a report. Nothing came of it." "Why didn't you tell me?" A pause that contained in its specific quality 44 years of a mother managing the distance between what her child needed to know and what would simply add weight to a load that was already heavy enough. "Because I knew what you would do," Maggie said. "What would I do? Oh, exactly what you're about to do." "I'm going to handle it legally," Sloane said. "Every step." "There are 2 kinds of people who say that," Maggie said. "The kind who mean it and the kind who say it because I need to hear it." "I mean it, Mom." Another pause. "The man's name is Victor Stowe. His son is Brant. Victor owns half of Phoenix, apparently. The kind of man who makes things disappear with a phone call." Sloane already had her keys. "I'll be there in 2 hours." She hung up. Rex Pruitt was in the doorway of the shop, jacket half on, reading the situation with the accuracy of 30 years of knowing Sloane Harlan's face. Rex was 65 years old, vice president of the Iron Road chapter, a Gulf War veteran who walked with a slight leftward lean he had carried home from Kuwait and never mentioned unless directly asked. He had the patience of someone who had been in situations where patience was the margin between outcomes. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough," she said. They rode hard through the mountain dark. Maggie's house in Mesa was the house Sloane had grown up in, a modest place in a neighborhood that had been built in the 70s and had aged the way solid things age not, without showing the years, but without losing the underlying quality that the years had built up rather than worn down. Same porch, same driveway, where the family car had been washed every Saturday morning, with the kind of cheerful regularity that is actually a form of keeping faith with what you have. Maggie opened the door before Sloane knocked. Sloane had seen her mother in many states. At her father's funeral, composed in the way that Sloane had not understood as courage, until she had attended enough funerals to know the difference between composure and numbness. On the day of both deployments, standing in the driveway, with the expression of someone doing the hardest possible version of a thing they had decided to do. At Dana's bedside, holding Dana's hand, with the simple competence of a woman for whom presence was the primary form of love. She had never seen her look small before. That landed first before the bruises, before the wrist Sloane immediately photographed with the clinical efficiency the Army had trained into her before any of the practical things. The smallness, the way 6 weeks of managed fear had done something to the posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being made of stronger material than whatever came at her. Sloane photographed the bruises, finger-shaped, dark purple, 3 days old and still deepening. She looked at the photographs on her phone. She looked at her mother. She said, "I'm going to handle this." Maggie's eyes filled briefly. She turned away. I should have told you sooner, she said. I just didn't want to be a burden. Sloane pulled her into a hug, felt her mother's shoulders, the thinness of them, the surprising fragility of someone who had always seemed to Sloane built from more durable material than ordinary people. You are never a burden, Sloane said. You're my mother. This is how it works now. The emergency meeting of the Iron Road chapter convened that night. The clubhouse sat on the eastern edge of Scottsdale, an unmarked building that required no sign because everyone who needed to know its location already knew it. 22 members sat around the long table. Every one of them had served. The collective military service in that room added up to more years than most people spent fully awake. They had been in places that required things of them, and they had provided those things, and they had come home changed, and had found in each other a company that understood the change without requiring its explanation. Sloane stood at the head of the table, Rex on her right, Hank Calloway, 57 years old, the club's best researcher, on her left. Boyd Morrow, built like something designed specifically for the purpose of being in difficult physical spaces near the far end. She laid out the facts, clean without theater, her mother's name, her age, the pattern of harassment, the bruises, the police report that had been absorbed without producing any visible response. When she finished, she set her hands flat on the table. We do this right, she said. Legal, documented. Every action on camera, every decision time-stamped, every piece of evidence handled in a way that any court in the country would be comfortable looking at. Boyd said, you want us to pay the kid a visit? No, Sloane said. The word was not loud. It did not need to be. I am in a legal dispute over the garage. I cannot give anyone a reason to look at us sideways. We are citizens. We are veterans. We operate within the law, especially when the law is not operating correctly, because that is precisely when it matters most. Someone at the far end said, even when they don't, especially when they don't, Sloane said. That is the difference between us and them. That is the point. She looked around the table, met each set of eyes. From tonight until this is resolved, someone is with my mother every time she leaves the house. Rotation, discreet. She will not know the full extent of it, but she will never be alone. 22 heads nodded, not reluctantly, with the particular quality of people who have been asked to do something that aligns exactly with who they understand themselves to be. One more thing. Sloane took out her phone, brought up the photographs of the bruises, held the screen so the whole table could see, then set it face down. People look at this patch and they make assumptions, she said. They have for years. Tonight and in the days ahead, we show them what those assumptions miss. She looked at the table. We are not here because someone touched a club member's family. We are here because a 78-year-old woman is afraid to buy groceries, and the system that is supposed to prevent that has been purchased by someone with enough money to purchase it. She paused. That is our concern. That is always our concern. Hank Calloway was the first to speak after the silence that followed. I'll start on Stowe development tonight, he said. Get me everything by Wednesday, Sloane said, because Wednesday is when this ends. Hank Calloway was 57 years old and possessed the particular gift of being entirely unremarkable in appearance while being precisely remarkable in usefulness. He looked like a man who repaired appliances or organized warehouse inventory medium height. Forgettable, faced the kind of presence that rooms absorb without registering. He could sit in a county records office for 4 hours and no one would remember him being there. 3 days after the meeting, he came into the garage with a folder and the expression of a man who has confirmed what he suspected and found the confirmation no more comfortable for being expected. He spread the contents on Sloane's workbench. Security footage, still frames dated and annotated. 6 weeks of a Walmart parking lot from the camera above the western entrance, covering the third row where a white-haired woman had parked every Wednesday for 15 years. The images were clear enough. A young man appearing in the lot 10 to 15 minutes after a specific vehicle arrived, consistently without variation. The body language visible across the distance of the still frames, his forward lean, her backward step, the narrowing of the space between them as the weeks progressed. This is 4 separate Wednesdays, Hank said, all from before last week. Where did this come from? The store keeps a 6-week archive. I know someone. Sloane looked at the images for a long time. There's more, Hank said. Property records, county assessor data, purchase histories, a map of the Phoenix metro with 4 locations marked in red. 4 shopping centers, Hank said, all experienced significant drops in assessed value over 6 to 12 months. Crime reports increased. Vandalism. A pattern of incidents, nothing individually prosecutable, that created the impression the locations were unsafe for customers. Businesses left. Foot traffic declined. Property values fell. He pointed to the dates. Then Victor Stowe purchased all four at prices between 30 and 40% below their pre-decline valuations. How much total? Documentable profit, $18.7 million over 4 years. Sloan looked at the map, at the four red marks, and my mother. Part of the pattern, Hank said. I found 6 other names. Elderly residents, regular customers at those same locations, all subjected to the same approach. Fake accident cash demand, escalating harassment. None of the police reports went anywhere. 3 of them stopped going out. He paused. One woman, 81 years old, hasn't left her apartment in 4 months. The garage was quiet for a moment. There is one more thing, Hank said. He produced a single sheet, a digitized newspaper clipping, 33 years old. A photograph of a young man standing in front of a modest piece of land, a court order visible in his hand. His expression was the expression of someone who has just lost something and has, in losing it, made a very specific decision about who they are going to be from this point forward. The young man was Victor Stowe, 22 years old, East Texas, 1991. A larger development company had used what the article described as aggressive competitive tactics to force the sale of his land at a fraction of its value. The article was sympathetic. It described the injustice plainly. He was a victim, Hank said. Sloan read the caption twice. She looked at the photograph beside the property records, the young man with the court order, the 4 red marks on the map, $18.7 million, 6 elderly people afraid to leave their homes. He was, she said, and then he decided that what happened to him was a technique rather than an injustice. She set the documents down. Some people, when the system breaks them, refuse to break anyone else. They know what it costs. She was quiet for a moment. And some people decide the system was right and they just needed to be on the other side of it. Rex, who had come in quietly and was standing near the wall, said nothing. Get me everything on the shell company structure, Sloan said. Everything you can find on the financial architecture. I want to know what a federal investigator would find before they find it. And Hank said, I'll have more by the weekend. Get me what you can by Wednesday, Sloan said, because Wednesday is when this ends. She had said it before. She meant it the same both times. Wednesday arrived cold and clear after the previous night's rain, the way Arizona mornings sometimes do, the storm having moved through and left behind air so transparent that distances which had seemed obscured now presented themselves with unsettling clarity. By 9 in the morning, the Walmart parking lot held 4 vehicles that appeared to have no relationship to each other. A pickup truck 2 rows east of the main entrance, the driver with a coffee thermos and the particular quality of stillness of someone who has waited in observation positions before and learned how to make that waiting look like nothing at all. A panel van near the western exit, the signage on its side belonging to a plumbing company that had not operated for 3 years. A dark blue SUV at the north edge positioned at an angle that covered the 3rd row without making that coverage obvious. Inside the store, a woman in a canvas jacket moved through the garden supply section with the measured pace of someone who had found every reason to be exactly where she was. 2 miles away in a strip mall parking lot, Sloan sat on her road glide with the engine off. On the seat beside her, her phone with the camera open and running connected via live broadcast to accounts she had spent 3 days directing people toward. 9,000 people were watching an empty frame. She had posted under her own name simply, "Something important may happen Wednesday morning. If you believe elderly people deserve to be safe, watch this channel." She had not explained further. She had not needed to. She had not told her mother about the plan. This had not been comfortable. But she understood with the particular tactical clarity that had served her in places where the cost of miscalculation was high that telling Maggie would change how Maggie behaved. She needed Maggie to be herself. An ordinary woman doing an ordinary errand, which was exactly what she was doing, exactly what she had done every Wednesday for 15 years. She needed what was about to happen to be visible for what it was. At 10:03, Rex's voice in her earpiece, "She's here." Sloan watched the clock. At 10:47, black BMW entering from the south. Plate matches, Stowe parking now. 2 others with him. Sloan pressed the broadcast button on her phone. The feed went live. Boyd from inside, "She's at her car, loading bags." Sloan started the Road Glide's engine. Let it idle. Stowe approaching. She sees him, shaking her head. He's talking. She's trying to get in the car. Sloan pulled onto the road. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away. He grabbed again. Half a mile. He's getting loud. She has her phone out. He knocked it out of her hand. The other two are flanking her now. Quarter mile. Rex's voice. Sloan, he has his hand on her throat. She said into the radio now. From 4 directions from positions selected 3 days earlier, with the precision of people who had planned operations in environments with higher stakes, 20 motorcycles entered the parking lot. Their headlights cut through the morning brightness. Their engines at idle produced a sound felt as much as heard, a low and organized vibration that moved through the asphalt and into the souls of every person standing on it. They came from north, south, east, and west, fanning into the lot with the unhurried certainty of something that had been arranged by people who were not making it up as they went. They stopped in a rough semicircle, 40 feet from where Brant Stowe stood, with his hand around Margaret Harlan's throat. 20 engines cut off. In the silence that followed, the only sounds were the distant noise of the store, the ticking of cooling metal, and the fine mist of resumed rain that softened the edges of things without changing their essential nature. Sloan swung off her road glide. She was 5'7" and 62 years old, and had spent those years becoming exactly who she was and who she was, walked toward Brant Stowe with the deliberate pace of someone who is not hurrying, because hurrying would imply uncertainty about the outcome. She stopped 10 feet away. She looked at her mother first. Maggie was still standing. Her hand was at her throat where the grip had been, but her eyes were clear and her jaw was set. And when she met Sloane's gaze, she communicated in the way that 78 years of being this particular woman had made her able to communicate things without words, that she was frightened and she was not backing down. And both of these things were equally and simultaneously true. Sloane looked at Brant. "Let her go," she said, not loudly, without inflection. "The way you give a command when the command is not in question." Brant's hand dropped. Maggie stepped back and Sloane moved half a step forward, and her mother found her arm and steadied. Sloane did not take her eyes off the young man. Brant looked at the motorcycles. He looked at the 20 people who had dismounted and were standing with the particular stillness of individuals who had learned in various demanding places that stillness communicates more than movement. He looked back at Sloane. He said, "This doesn't concern you." Sloane said, "That is my mother you had your hand on." The words went into the air between them and stayed there. Behind Brant, his 2 associates were already backing toward the BMW. But Brant stood his ground with the particular stubbornness of a 28-year-old who has been raised inside a system that has never once told him the true cost of his decisions. "You don't know who my father is," he said. "Don't need to," Sloane said. "Victor Stowe, he owns this city." "Still don't need to. He'll take everything you have." Sloane looked at him steadily. She saw beneath the performance something more specific and more complicated than simple cruelty. She saw a young man who had been raised by a version of the world that had never told him the truth about consequences, who was about to encounter them for the first time and did not yet understand what he was encountering. She did not soften this observation with sympathy. She had seen the photographs of her mother's wrist. A black Mercedes moved into the parking lot with the unhurried pace of a car that costs more than most people's houses and has learned to move accordingly. It stopped 15 feet away. A man stepped out who carried himself with the precision of someone who has spent decades constructing a very particular presentation of himself and has largely succeeded. Victor Stowe was 55 years old, custom suit damp from the rain still composed. The expression of a man who has been in rooms where power was distributed unevenly and has always been on the favorable side of that distribution. He surveyed the parking lot. "Is there a problem here, ladies and gentlemen?" Sloane turned to face him. "Your son just put his hand on a 78-year-old woman," she said, "on camera." Victor smiled, professional practice deployed at precisely the right moment. "I'm certain there's been some kind of misunderstanding here." "No misunderstanding. I watched him do it. We have it recorded." "Do you have documentation?" Victor said. "Because without documentation..." Sloane held up her phone. On the screen, a small red dot pulsed. "Recording started when I arrived," she said. "Video and audio, and we are currently streaming live to," she checked the count, 12,400 people. The number had doubled in 4 minutes. Something moved through Victor Stowe's eyes. Not fear, the rapid recalculation of someone who has walked into a room arranged differently than anticipated. "And you are," he said, "Sloane Harlan, President Iron Road MC Flagstaff. Chapter." She paused. "And Margaret Harlan's daughter." Victor absorbed this, adjusted. "Ms. Harlan," he said, shifting to the register of a man who has long understood that most complications can be navigated through the proper application of money and the right framing. "I have enormous respect for veterans, for what you've all sacrificed. I'm sure we can resolve this like adults. My son will apologize. We'll compensate your mother for her distress, and we can all go home. She doesn't want your money, Sloan said. Victor tilted his head, as though he had heard a sentence that did not parse in any language he was fluent in. Everyone wants money, Miss Harlan, particularly people in your, not her. He looked at Margaret Harlan for the first time. She was standing straight, both hands at her sides, the fear present in the set of her mouth, but overridden by something that had been there much longer and was much more durable. Then what does she want? Victor said. Maggie's voice was quiet and entirely steady. Justice, she said. I want justice. Victor actually laughed. A genuine laugh, unperformed, the laugh of a man who finds something amusing despite the situation calling for something else. Justice, he said. How very quaint. He looked at Sloan. Your mother filed a police report last week. It went nowhere. Do you know why? Well, Sloan said nothing. Because I made one phone call, Victor said. One call, and the matter was resolved. That is how the city functions, Miss Harlan. I have considerably more money than you can readily imagine, and money in sufficient quantities creates certain efficiencies in public administration. He was saying this to 15,000 people. He did not know that yet. Sloan looked at her phone. 15,000 people, she said. Just heard you say that. Every word live right now. She looked at Victor. You can buy police, Mr. Stowe. You can buy judges and editors and zoning boards. But there is one thing money cannot buy back, and that is a video that is already shared. She paused. By morning, everyone in Phoenix will have watched your son put his hand on a 78-year-old woman, and they will have heard you explain how you make police reports disappear. She stepped closer. You can buy a great many things. You cannot buy back your reputation. Sirens in the distance, getting louder. 6 police cars pulled into the lot. Chief Aldous Dodds stepped from the lead vehicle. 53 years old, gray-templed, the kind of face that photographs well at ribbon cuttings. He looked at Victor Stowe with the brief implicit recognition of 2 men who have standing arrangements. Then he looked at Sloan. Ms. Harlan, he said with the flatness of someone whose neutrality was doing considerable work. I need everyone to disperse. Not until you arrest the man who assaulted my mother, Sloan said. I don't take orders from 17,000 witnesses, Sloan said, holding up the phone. You want to explain to them why you're asking the victim to leave? Officer Nate Forsyth stepped forward from the line of patrol cars. 29 years old, 3 years on the force, his face still in the process of deciding what kind of face it was ultimately going to be. He touched Dodd's arm. Chief, he said quietly, people are filming from the store entrance. If we walk away, he nodded toward the growing crowd outside the Walmart's automatic doors, it won't hold. Dodd stood in the rain caught between Victor Stowe's money and 17,000 people watching his next decision. He looked at Brant Stowe. Brant Stowe, he said through teeth that appeared to be functioning somewhat independently of his preferences. You are under arrest for assault. You have the right to remain silent. Brant's face moved through several expressions. None of them were remorse. Victor stepped forward. Don't say a word. I'll have you out within the hour. As the cuffs went on, Sloan looked at the phone in her hand. 19,000 people. She turned to her mother. Let's get you home, Mom. Maggie took her arm. They walked past Victor Stowe, past the police cars, past the crowd that had gathered at the entrance, with phones raised past all of it, through the rain toward the truck. Victor called after them. This isn't over, Harlan. Sloan stopped, turned. No, she said. It's not. It's just beginning. She turned back and walked with her mother through the rain and did not look back, and the sound of 19,000 people watching felt for the first time in a long time like the beginning of something that mattered. The garage was quiet at 4 in the morning. Sloan sat on a stool at her workbench with coffee that had been hot an hour earlier and was now the temperature of something that had given up on the idea. Her phone was face up on the steel surface in front of her, and every few seconds it moved slightly from the vibrations of incoming notifications like a compass needle that cannot find north because north keeps shifting. 211,000 views. She had watched the number climb through the night, the way you watch a river rising in flood season, not with alarm but with careful attention, understanding that moving things have their own momentum in their own direction and do not particularly consult the preferences of people watching from the bank. The video had traveled in the way that certain things travel when they contain something that people recognize as true. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, not because the footage was technically exceptional, but because at a level below conscious thought, people who watched it understood they were seeing something real. An old woman standing straight in a parking lot in the rain, not flinching. A silver-haired woman in a leather cut walking toward the situation that most people would have walked away from. A moment in which the ordinary machinery of power and money had been caught briefly and completely in open light. People share what feels true. By 5 in the morning, 3 television stations had left messages. By 6, the Arizona Republic and 2 wire services. By 7, when Rex arrived with breakfast burritos, wrapped in foil, and the expression of a man who had also not slept, the count had passed 250,000. Rex set one of the burritos on the workbench without commentary. Sloan did not look up. Channel 5 wants an interview, Rex said. No. 3 also, and the Republic sent someone to the clubhouse. Hank spoke to her for about 4 minutes before she understood he wasn't going to give her anything she didn't already have. Good. Rex sat on the second stool. He ate in silence for a moment, which was one of the things Sloan valued most about Rex Pruitt after 30 years of knowing him. He understood the weight of silence and never tried to replace it with something lighter. Your mother, he said finally. I called her at 2. She's home. She's all right. She's not speaking to the press. She agreed to that easily. Sloan looked up for the first time. She never agrees to anything easily. She agreed because when I explained the reasoning, she found it sound. She's not a woman who argues with sound reasoning, she just argues with everything else. Rex almost smiled. The lawsuit arrived at 9:17 that morning, delivered by a process server with the professional neutrality of someone who separated themselves from the content of what they carried years ago. 27 pages that translated in plain language to this Victor Stowe was suing Sloan Harlan, Margaret Harlan, and 3 named members of the Iron Road chapter for defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and loss of business reputation. $5 million. Sloan was standing at her workbench when it arrived. She accepted the envelope, signed the confirmation, set it on the steel surface, and picked up her wrench. She finished the bolt she had been working on. Then she picked up the envelope, opened it, read it cover to cover with the focused attention of someone extracting information from text designed to obscure it. When she finished, she set it down. They just made the second mistake, she said. She called Owen Callister. Owen was 54, a former JAG officer, civilian practice in Phoenix for 18 years. He had served with Sloan in the Gulf. He had stood at Dana's graveside. He had been waiting for Sloan's call since the previous night. Slap lawsuit, Owen said. Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's a pressure tool. They don't expect to win. The point is to make fighting it prohibitively expensive. They're betting you'll settle, drop your mother's voice in exchange for them dropping this one. That's not happening, Sloan said. I know, but Arizona has anti-slap protections. I can file a motion to dismiss, but the process takes 3 to 6 months. Longer if they appeal. The documentation Hank has, the pattern, the property records. How much does that help us? Considerably. But what would help more is the financial architecture. The shell companies, the transfer routes, the bank accounts. That requires subpoena power we don't have. Sloan sat with us for a moment. She thought about a phone number she had not used in 5 years. A man she owed a conversation and considerably more than a conversation. Not yet, she said. Keep building. That evening, Hank came in with his laptop and the expression of someone who has sat in front of a screen for 12 straight hours and found something whose shape he wishes were different. He opened the laptop on the workbench. A scanned newspaper article 33 years old that they had already reviewed. Then below it, additional documents Hank had found since. A follow-up piece, a legal filing, a settlement record, a property transaction from 1997. Victor Stowe, listed as primary buyer through a company called Meridian Holdings, an LLC incorporated in Delaware 6 months prior. He settled the lawsuit against the company that took his land, Hank said. Got money, used it as seed capital for his first Phoenix acquisition. And the method he used for that first acquisition, the pressure campaign, the manufactured decline in property values, it matches the pattern we've been documenting exactly. Sloan looked at the dates. He was 24 years old, Hank said. He had just been victimized by the same technique, and his first act with the settlement money was to apply it to someone else. Rex was in the corner listening. Sloan sat with the documents spread in front of her and was quiet for almost 2 minutes, the stillness that the people who knew her had learned to read not as absence but as its opposite, as total internal attention that produced no external movement. The system broke him, she said finally, and he had a choice about what to do with that. She looked at the photograph of the young man with the court order. Some people, when they've been broken that way, spend the rest of their lives refusing to do it to anyone else, because they know the precise shape of what it costs. She paused. And some people decide the technique was sound and they just needed to be on the right side of it. She closed the laptop. Get me everything on the LLC structure, she said. Every Delaware registration, every account you can trace. I want to know what a federal investigator would find when they start looking. Hank said, I'll have it by Friday. 3 days later on a Thursday night, something happened that clarified several things. Maggie had been to the pharmacy, and then on her own initiative to the library, which Sloan learned about after the fact from Boyd Morrow, who had followed at 50 yards and reported it with the expression of a man who found the detour both inconvenient and admirable. Maggie had been telling Sloan for days that she was tired of being followed. Sloan had been saying a little longer. Maggie had been making the sound that meant she was not agreeing, but had chosen not to escalate at this particular moment. Boyd confirmed she was inside the house at 7:45. At 10:19, Boyd called. His voice was tight. Someone threw a brick through your mother's front window. Sloan was on her bike in 4 minutes. She ran 2 red lights. She reached the house in Mesa 16 minutes after the call, which was faster than the distance should have permitted. The living room window had been broken from the outside. Glass covered the carpet in a pattern that told the story of direction and force. The brick sat on the coffee table where Boyd had placed it carefully. Taped to it was a piece of paper text in clean block letters, the font chosen to remove personality from the message. Drop it or next time it won't be a brick. Maggie was on the couch with her hands in her lap and a cup of tea and the expression of someone who is choosing actively and in real time the precise extent to which she is going to allow herself to be frightened by this. She looked up when Sloan came through the door. I'm all right, she said. Before anything else. Sloan checked her. She was. Sloan looked at the brick. At the note, the font was clean. The spacing was deliberate. Someone had sat down and made decisions about how to do this, had typed it and printed it and brought it here with intent. This was not Brant Stowe. Brant was under arrest. This was someone acting on instructions. Boyd had called the local police. An officer had come photograph the damage taken, a report suggested, with the confidence of someone who has not thought very carefully about the suggestion that it was probably vandals, possibly connected to the publicity, nothing specifically targeted. He had mentioned increased patrols. He had left. Sloan looked at the report number. She put it in her phone. She walked outside onto the porch and dialed the number she had not dialed in 5 years. 3 rings. The voice that answered was the voice of someone who had been awake, not recently awakened, but sustained awake. The voice of someone whose occupation does not accommodate the kind of sleep that other professions take for granted. Sloan, the voice said. Sterling Dutton was 51 years old, a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in the Phoenix field office. Originally from Western Montana, with the directness of that origin still present in everything he said, and a patience that came from growing up in a place where patience was a survival skill and not an optional quality. He had been in the vehicle with Sloan when the IED hit outside Mosul in 2004. Left rear seat. The vehicle had rolled. Sloan had gotten the door open. He had been in financial crimes for 9 years. He was good at it. Sterling, as she said, how long have you been watching Victor Stowe? The pause was longer than a pause of someone deciding whether to answer. It was the pause of someone deciding how. 18 months, he said. Sloan closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. Tell me what you have. Tell me yours first. They talked for 40 minutes. She described the property records, the acquisition pattern, the 6 victims, the shell company structure Hank had partially mapped. Sterling listened without interrupting, the technique of someone who already knows portions of what they are hearing and is taking inventory of what is new. When she finished, Sterling was quiet. We have the financial architecture, he said. 3 LLCs in Delaware, 2 in Nevada, bank accounts across 4 states, a pattern of transfers consistent with money laundering at scale. Enough for a case. He paused. What we haven't had is public pressure. Stowe operates in the particular shadow that money creates around itself. The people who knew what he was doing had reasons to stay quiet. The people who didn't know lacked enough information to make noise. Until the video, Sloan said. Until the video. The view count, the press coverage, the public anger, all of it changed the calculation in Washington. We are now authorized to move. Sterling's voice shifted register slightly. Someone threw a brick through your mother's window tonight. Yes. Get me the report number. I'll have the fingerprint work done in by people who are not in Chief Aldous Dodd's department. A pause. Sloan, we are moving Friday morning, 6 a.m. Simultaneous warrants. His house, his office, the LLC addresses of record. All at once. Another pause. I need your mother somewhere safe Thursday night through Friday. I'll handle it. Keep doing what you're doing, Sterling said. Let Stowe believe he's managing the situation. The more comfortable he feels between now and Friday, the less prepared he'll be when the morning comes. She said she understood. She hung up and stood on the porch in the desert night, listening. The particular quality of that silence, the specific texture of it, the way the desert at night has a presence that is not quite sound, but is not absence either, something that people who grew up with it find in no other place and miss in every place that lacks it. She went back inside. Her mother was still on the couch. The tea was finished. Maggie was looking at her in the way she had always looked at her, directly, without deflection, reading something in her face that Sloane had long ago stopped attempting to hide, because Maggie had always been better at seeing it than Sloane had been at concealing it. The FBI, Maggie said, not a question. Go pack a bag, Sloane said. Enough for 2 nights. Maggie looked at her for a moment. Good, she said. About time. The following morning brought a development Sloane had anticipated from a direction she had not. Owen called at 8:15. Judge Wendell Croft has recused himself from your mother's case. Filed this morning. No explanation in the filing. What did you find? Sloane said. His daughter has been employed by Stowe Development Group for 3 years. Senior project manager. Her salary in the company's LLC documentation is substantially above market rate for her experience level. Sloane sat with this. He was already in position, she said. The arrangement predates your mother's harassment by at least 2 years, Owen confirmed, which means when Victor Stowe understood there was potential exposure from what his son was doing, he already had a judge who would either rule in his favor or need to recuse. Either outcome was useful. A favorable ruling helps him. A recusal buys time and disrupts momentum. He planned for pushback, Sloane said. He planned for the possibility of it. We've been reassigned to Judge Patricia Holbrook. Clean record, strong reputation, no connection to the Stowe network that I can find. Better for us in the long run, but the recusal process adds 3 to 4 weeks. Build the case, Sloane said. Everything clean. 2 days after the brick, a young man came to the garage. He was in his early 20s, lean the way people are lean when metabolism is doing what discipline eventually needs to take over, his face still in the process of settling into whatever it was ultimately going to be. He sat in his pickup truck in the parking lot for several minutes before coming inside. Sloane noticed this and said nothing. His name was Sawyer Tatum. He worked night security at the Mesa Walmart. He had watched the parking lot footage from the security office on the night everything happened, and had then watched the video online 9 times and had then gone back to the archive before it cycled over. He was holding a USB drive. He held it out toward Sloane with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is enforcing it against their own uncertainty. 6 weeks, he said, every Wednesday, every time she came in, every time he showed up after her. It's all on there. Sloane took the drive. Why, she said. He looked at the floor, then back up. My grandfather ran a hardware store for 30 years, he said. When I was a kid, that store was just where things got fixed, where he knew everybody's name and they knew his. He stopped. About 8 years ago, the block started having problems. Break-ins, vandalism. Parking situation got difficult. Streetlights were out for months. Customers stopped coming. Grandfather couldn't make the lease. Sold for almost nothing. A pause. He died 2 years later. My mom said losing the store took something from him that medicine couldn't address. He looked at the USB drive. I don't know if the same people did that to his block. I have no way of knowing. But I know what it looks like when someone is being pushed out. He met Sloane's eyes. Your mother didn't back down, even with that man's hand on her throat. So I'm not backing down either. Sloane held out her hand. He shook it. Thank you, Sawyer, she said. After he left, Sloane plugged the drive into her laptop. 6 weeks, every Wednesday. The first approach, Brant's body language cordial aggressive, Maggie's head tilting in the way it tilted when she was listening to something she found suspicious. The second week closer, more insistent. The third and fourth, the 2 additional men appearing for the first time, their positioning around Maggie's car, deliberate and unmistakable. The 5th week, the moment where harassment crossed into contact, Brant's hand on Maggie's wrist, the first physical evidence of escalation that a camera had captured. Owen reviewed the footage remotely and called within the hour. This changes the character of the case entirely, he said. A documented pattern of escalating conduct over 6 weeks from a source no one can argue was set up by your family, showing premeditation and deliberate targeting. A pause. Sloane, we were going to be able to make a case before. Now we have a strong one. That evening, Sloane called her mother. She told her about the anti-slap motion Owen was preparing, about the security footage. about the fingerprint analysis Sterling was having done on the brick. Maggie said, "Is it almost over?" "Getting close," Sloan said. "That's not an answer." "No," Sloan said. "It's not, but it's what I have right now." She found out how not yet over it was the following morning. Rex called at 6:43. He had a contact at the county recorder's office, a woman who had served in the Navy and had developed over years of working there the habit of noting certain kinds of unusual filing activity and mentioning it to certain people she trusted. "Victor Stowe moved last night," Rex said. "Filed a documentation for asset transfers from the Stowe Development Group into 3 new LLCs, all Delaware, all registered within the past 72 hours. He's moving the money." Sloan was standing before Rex finished the sentence. "How long does he have before the transfer's complete?" "End of business Friday. The filings suggest everything moves by close of business tomorrow." Today was Wednesday, 48 hours. She called Sterling Dutton. Sterling picked up on the first ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he already knew. "I saw it," Sterling said. "This changes your timeline." "It accelerates it," he said. "We were already planning Friday morning. We're now expanding the warrant scope to include the LLC registration addresses and the accounts associated with the new entities." A pause. He overplayed it. The speed and scale of this asset movement in this context is not the action of a man managing a situation. It's the action of a man who is afraid. And afraid men do things that are useful to people watching them. "You needed him to move," Sloan said. "We needed him to move in a way that was unambiguous. What he did last night is exhibit one of the government's evidence of consciousness of guilt." A pause. "Keep your mother where she is through Friday. After 6 a.m. Friday morning, Victor Stowe's ability to manage anything becomes the federal government's concern to manage." 48 hours, Sloan said. 48 hours, Sterling confirmed. She hung up. She sat in the garage for a long time in the silence that followed. The 1911 was in its box on the shelf. The photograph of her unit was on the wall. Mosul 2004. 12 people in front of a Humvee squinting into desert sun, young with the particular quality that people are young when they are about to be tested. Not innocent exactly, but not yet fully formed into what the testing will make them. Tommy Hale was standing at her right shoulder in the photograph laughing at something outside the frame. He had been dead within the month. She looked at the photograph. She thought about what it meant to hold a position. In Iraq, it had been literal geography, a perimeter, a thing that had to be maintained because what was behind it could not afford to be lost. The holding was physical, immediate, measurable in minutes and meters. This was different. This was 48 hours of disciplined stillness, while the machinery that had been assembled over 2 weeks completed its work. This was the hardest kind of holding, the kind that requires you to trust other people's processes and other people's competence when everything in your nature says to move, to act, to place yourself between the threat and what you are protecting. She had learned this too, later than the more active lessons, but thoroughly. Sometimes the protection is not the person standing in the parking lot. Sometimes it is the person who built the case, and the agent who filed the warrant, and the judge who signed it, and the young man who checked an archive before it cycled over because his grandfather lost a hardware store and he had never stopped thinking about it. Sometimes the protection is distributed across more people than you can see. She picked up her wrench. She worked on the Harley on the lift for the rest of the afternoon, the radio playing low, the garage settling into the late heat that comes off Arizona asphalt in the hours before evening arrives and loosens its grip. She ate the sandwich Rex had left without tasting it. She answered texts with brief responses. She called her mother twice, once at noon and once at 5, not because anything had happened, but because Maggie deserved to hear her voice at regular intervals regardless. On the second call, Maggie said, "When can I go home?" Sloan said, "Saturday." Maggie said, "You said Friday." Sloan said, "Saturday is close to Friday." Maggie made the sound that meant she knew Sloan was navigating around something and had chosen for the moment not to pursue it. Sloan said, "I love you, Mom." Maggie said, "I know that, Sloan. I've known it for 62 years. Get some rest." She did not rest. She sat in the garage until the small hours of 1911 on the workbench before her hands performing the cleaning ritual with the automatic completeness of someone for whom the action had become inseparable from the mental state it produced. The radio played. Johnny Cash, the same station it had always been, when she needed to think, that particular voice that gave back something she could not name but had stopped needing to name. She looked at the photograph on the wall. Tommy Hale's laugh, caught permanently by whoever had taken the picture, existing now in the preserved present of the image. She had pulled him from the burning vehicle 20 years ago. She had been close enough to know immediately from the nature of the damage that the pulling was a form of honor rather than a rescue. He had gripped her hand. He had said, "Promise me, go home, take care of your family, don't waste your life." She had promised. She had kept it. Come home, Bill. The garage stayed close to Maggie. Spent 12 years not firing the pistol that sat on her workbench every morning, which was her private measure of whether she was honoring what she had said. She looked at the photograph. 2 more days, she said. She cleaned into the pistol. She placed it in the box. She locked the bow and did not put it back on the shelf. She put it in the cabinet below the shelf behind a row of parts manuals and closed the cabinet door and stood there for a moment with her hand still on the handle. It was a small gesture. The pistol went nowhere. It would be there tomorrow, exactly where she left it. But something in placing it lower, farther back, less immediately accessible, felt like a statement she was making to herself. That the ritual had served its purpose. That the daily reckoning with that question had been conducted long enough and consistently enough that the question no longer needed to live at arm's reach. She turned off the lights. She drove to Mesa to sit outside her mother's temporary residence for the remaining hours of the night, because some things are not about what is necessary. Some things are about what you are. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something baked earlier in the evening, and Sloane sat at the table in Rex's wife's house on Thursday night and watched her mother hold a mug with both hands, the way she had held every hot drink for as long as Sloane could remember, as though the warmth itself were something worth holding deliberately. Maggie had been quiet since dinner. Not the withdrawn kind of quiet. The productive kind, the sorting kind, the variety that arrives when a mind is working through the shape of something difficult and will surface with conclusions when the work is done. Rex's wife had excused herself after the meal with the tact of a woman who understood which conversations need the room to themselves. Maggie set the mug down. "Tell me what's happening tomorrow," she said. Sloane looked at her. She had been managing what Maggie knew for 3 weeks, not to diminish her, not because she did not trust her, but because every piece of information her mother carried was weight, and she was already carrying enough. But Maggie was looking at her now with the expression she had worn throughout Sloane's entire life when she was done accepting partial answers, and Sloane had learned at roughly age 11 that this expression was not the opening of a negotiation. She told her about Sterling, about the 18 months, about the warrants, the raids, the 6 a.m. timing, about the Delaware asset transfers Victor had attempted on Wednesday night, and what those transfers meant to the federal case. She did not mention the fingerprint results from the brick, because some information serves no purpose except to make a 78-year-old woman angrier than she needs to be when she needs to sleep. Maggie listened without interrupting. When Sloane finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So it was always bigger than me," she said. "It was always bigger than you," Sloane said. "You were the one who refused to back down. That made it visible." Maggie turned her mug slowly. "I almost backed down," she said, "the 4th week, when he came with the other 2 men and I couldn't get to my car. I sat in that parking lot for 11 minutes before I made myself drive home. The whole drive I was thinking, just pay him. You have savings? It would hurt, but it would stop." Sloane said nothing. "What stopped me," Maggie said, "was thinking about what your father would have said. Not that he would have told me to fight. He would have told me to do whatever kept me safe. But he would have found intolerable a world where a man could put his hands on a woman in a parking lot and have it cost him nothing." She paused. "And I found that I found it intolerable too, so I didn't pay him." She looked at Sloane directly. "I wish I had called you sooner." "You called when you needed to," Sloane said. "I called when I had no other option." "Same thing, Mom." She almost smiled, the specific almost smile Sloane had been seeing her whole life, the expression of someone who finds a statement both inaccurate and too generous to argue with. "What happens to us after tomorrow?" Maggie said. "Victor Stowe will be in federal custody, his assets frozen, his ability to conduct anything managed by the federal government from 6 in the morning onward." Maggie nodded slowly. "And Brant?" Sloane looked at the table. "That depends on decisions Brant makes between now and tomorrow morning." She did not elaborate. She had her own theory based on documents Hank had found, internal Stowe development memos, showing a pattern of Victor insulating himself from exposure by positioning associates as responsible parties when things went wrong. A pattern applied to a business partner in 2015, resulting in that partner serving 14 months in federal prison for transactions Victor had directed. Whether Brant had seen those memos, whether Brant had arrived at the understanding that he was to his father a resource to be deployed and discarded when the cost-benefit calculation changed, that was something only Brant could determine. Sloane stood and carried both mugs to the sink. "You should sleep," she said. Maggie rose with the careful deliberateness of a body that has accumulated a great many mornings and takes each new one seriously as a result. She put her hand on Sloane's arm. "You know what I realize," she said, "about you and the people you ride with?" Sloane waited. "People see those leather cuts, and they see what they've been told to see," Maggie said. "The reputation, the stories." She looked at Sloane steadily. "What I saw was 22 people who spent their own time and their own resources to make sure an old woman they had never met could buy groceries without being afraid." She paused. Dana would have liked those people. The mention of Dana arrived in Sloane's chest the way Dana's name always arrived, with the specific weight of someone who had been gone long enough that the mention was no longer surprising, but had not been gone long enough to stop carrying what it carried. "Get some sleep, Mom," Sloane said. Maggie patted her arm once and went down the hall. Sloane sat back down at the table. She thought about the garage dispute, Dana's brother and his attorneys, and the months of filings. She had spent enough weeks fighting for something real that the abstract battle over paperwork had lost its capacity to feel like the ground beneath her feet. Whatever the courts decided, the garage was where she went to work, where Dana had told her to go, where the people who trusted her brought the machines they cared about. The deed was a document. The work was something else entirely. She sat with this until it settled into something quieter than a thought. At 2 in the morning, she drove to her mother's street in Mesa and parked at the corner with the engine off. The house was dark. Boyd Morrow's motorcycle was parked 3 doors down with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to be exactly where he is needed without requiring acknowledgement. Sloane sat behind the wheel and watched the street. The neighborhood had the particular quiet of residential places at 2 in the morning, suspended the ordinary rhythms, paused, and waiting to resume. A dog somewhere. A sprinkler system on a timer. The soft sound of a car on a cross street a block over. The kind of stillness that is not empty but full of everything that will recommence in a few hours. She had done guard duty in conditions considerably more demanding than a quiet Mesa street, but those had lacked something that this had. Her mother was behind that window. 78 years old, sleeping, she hoped, with the settled ease of someone who has made a decision and carried it through and is now in the last quiet hours before the morning that resolves it. She watched the house until the sky began to change in the east. The first light in the desert comes not as brightness, but as a thinning of dark, a shift from black to deep blue that becomes lighter without any single identifiable moment of transition. She had seen it from checkpoints and forward operating bases and the porch of the house in Flagstaff in the weeks after Dana died, when the nights had felt longer than nights had any right to be. She had never watched it break over this particular house, this particular dark window. Her phone lit up at 5:53. "Sterling, we are in position. 6 minutes." She looked at the window. She typed back, "Copy." She sat very still in the dark for 6 minutes. At 6 in the morning in the Paradise Valley neighborhood of Phoenix, 6 FBI vehicles moved through the gates of a property whose security system had been remotely disabled 4 minutes earlier by people whose jobs specifically included knowing how to do that. Simultaneously, agents entered the Stowe development offices on the 14th floor of a downtown tower. 2 additional teams executed warrants at the Delaware LLC registration addresses. A 4th team arrived at the registered address of a property management company through which 3 of the shell LLCs conducted their nominal business. Sterling Dutton walked through the front door of the Paradise Valley estate and climbed a staircase of imported marble and knocked on a bedroom door. Victor Stowe had been awake, not because he had anticipated the raid with specific knowledge of the timing. He had been awake because men in his position in the days after the kinds of decisions he had made on Wednesday night do not sleep with the ease of men who have not made those decisions. He had been sitting in the chair by the window in his suit jacket, which he had put on at midnight, looking at the desert in the pre-dawn dark, and when the knock came, he understood before he opened the door what the knock meant. He had lived his entire adult life in proximity to this possibility. Not with fear exactly, with awareness. The way you live in Arizona summer, with awareness of the heat not foregrounded in every moment, but always present, shaping when and how you move. He opened the door. Sterling was standing in the hallway with the quality of stillness that genuine federal authority produces in the people who carry it seriously. Not aggressive, not theatrical. Simply present in a way that organized the space around it. Victor said, "My attorney," Sterling said, "please do call your attorney, Mr. Stowe. He's going to need time to review the scope of this morning's warrants." He handed Victor the documents. Victor read the first page, the second, the third. His expression was not what Sterling would later say he had expected. Not rage, not panic, not the performance of outrage that wealthy people sometimes deploy when confronted with consequences. It was something quieter. The expression of someone who has been running a very long race and has arrived at the finish line to discover what running it actually cost. He said, "I want to see my son." Sterling said, "Mr. Stowe, your son is currently in a separate federal interview room in our Phoenix field office." Victor looked up from the warrant. Sterling held his gaze. "He arrived at 5:45 this morning," Sterling said. "He asked to speak with an agent. He had his own counsel with him within 40 minutes, and the conversation that followed has been both extensive and useful to our investigation." Victor Stowe looked at the warrant documents. He looked at the window in the desert beyond it, gray and enormous in the early light. He said nothing. This was the moment. Not the handcuffs, not the arraignment, not the sentencing that was still months ahead. This was the actual moment in which something that had been running for 30 years stopped running. It stopped because a 78-year-old woman had refused to pay $9,000 she did not owe, because a 62-year-old woman had driven through a mountain night to stand between her mother and what was coming, because a young man had checked a security archive before it cycled over, because an FBI agent had waited 18 months for the right moment and found it in a parking lot video, because the thing about the open light is that it does not negotiate with the shadows that avoid it. What Brant Stowe had done at 5:45 in the morning was walk into the Phoenix FBI field office in civilian clothes, his own attorney beside him, an attorney he had hired the previous Tuesday with money from an account his father did not know about, and asked to speak with whoever was handling the Victor Stowe financial investigation. He had found the documents 3 days earlier, not by accident, by decision. By the act of a young man who had spent 3 weeks watching his father manage the fallout from the parking lot video and had begun to understand something about how his father managed things and what got used up in the process of managing them. He had found the 2015 files, the paper trail showing what Victor had done to his business partner, the documentation of how a man in Victor Stowe's position repositioned legal exposure onto the people around him. He had read it twice. Then he had called a lawyer. In the interview room, he said, "I want to be honest, I'm not doing this because I feel guilty." He looked at the agent across the table. "I'm doing this because I found out what my father does to people he's finished using, and I'm not going to be another one." He then provided 6 hours of testimony covering the operational details of the property acquisition scheme, the names of the individuals involved in the harassment campaigns, the financial architecture of the 3 Delaware LLCs, including account numbers and routing structures, and the specific conversation in which Victor Stowe had directed him to target Margaret Harlan at the Mesa Walmart. The last item had been recorded. Brant had been recording his father for 11 days. The case Owen Callister had called very strong became, in the weeks following the Friday morning raids, something federal prosecutors described with the careful language of their profession as comprehensive, and that everyone else described more simply as overwhelming. The civil inheritance dispute over Ironworks Garage was settled in December, 3 months after the Stowe verdicts. Dana's brother had been represented by a firm within the Stowe legal network, a connection that became difficult to sustain publicly after the federal proceedings. The settlement was quiet. The garage stayed. Sloan did not celebrate, because celebrating the continued right to keep something that was already yours seemed like an odd use of energy. She went back to work the same afternoon the paperwork was filed, because the Harley on the lift was not going to finish itself, and she had given her word about Christmas. The preliminary hearing for Brant Stowe was held on a Tuesday morning in a federal courthouse with the high ceilings and wood paneling and quality of light that federal courthouses everywhere used to communicate the gravity of what occurs within them without achieving warmth. Sloan sat in the front row with Maggie beside her. Behind them, the 22 members of the Iron Road chapter in their cleanest leather, arranged with the straightness of people who understood that certain occasions call for a certain posture. Brant was brought in wearing civilian clothes. He looked diminished in the way people look when the context that gave them their particular shape has been removed. Without the BMW and the entitlement and the architecture of his father's world surrounding him, he was simply a 28-year-old man in the presence of his decisions. He entered his plea. The cooperation agreement was read into the record. The judge asked if there was anything he wished to say. He stood. He looked at the table briefly. Then he looked at the front row at Margaret Harlan. He said, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I haven't earned that right." His voice was steady in the way that voices are when a person has decided not to perform anything. "I want you to know that I watched the video of you in the parking lot after everything. The way you stood." He stopped. I had never in my life seen someone refuse to be made smaller than the situation was trying to make them. And I was the situation. Another pause. I'm 28 years old and I had never been truly ashamed of myself before that night. Not really. He sat back down. The courtroom was quiet. Maggie looked at the young man across the room. She held his gaze for a long moment. She did not speak. She did not need to. The looking was enough. The looking said, I see you and I hear what you are saying, and whether it leads anywhere worth going is entirely up to you now. Brant Stowe received 15 years with a cooperation agreement to be evaluated at the midpoint. Victor Stowe's trial was not long. His attorneys filed what expensive attorneys file, argued what expensive attorneys argue, and achieved what the evidence available to them made inevitable. Judge Patricia Holbrook looked at Victor Stowe over the rims of her glasses with the expression of someone who has spent 3 decades presiding over what human beings do to each other and has arrived at an age where she no longer feels obligated to soften what she observes. She said, Mr. Stowe, in 30 years on this bench, I have sentenced a considerable range of defendants for a considerable range of offenses. What I find unusual in your case, even by the standards of what I have seen, is the systematic and deliberate architecture of the harm you caused. You did not stumble into criminal conduct. You designed it, refined it over 4 years and $19 million, and applied it to 6 elderly people with the resources and the intelligence to have built something entirely legitimate and chose not to. She set her papers down. I sentence you to 38 years in federal prison. You will not be eligible for consideration of parole for 20 years. All assets obtained through fraudulent means will be seized and distributed to your victims. Stowe Development Group will be dissolved. You are barred permanently from conducting business in Arizona. The gavel came down. Victor Stowe was led out in handcuffs and did not look at the gallery and did not look at the space where his son had sat and did not look at anything except the middle distance, which is what a person looks at when the things they have built their life around facing have become things they can no longer face. Chief Aldous Dodds submitted his resignation the following week. Officer Nate Forsyth was appointed to a newly created position within the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, focused specifically on financial crimes against elderly residents, funded in part by the Stowe Asset Recovery. The civil settlement came through on a Thursday afternoon in early December, in the way civil settlements come through, not dramatically, but in a phone call from Owen Callister that Sloan took standing in the garage with a wrench in her hand. Owen said the number. Sloan set the wrench down. She called her mother. Maggie said, I don't want his money. It isn't his anymore. It was recovered from what he took. A silence in which Sloan could hear the working of a mind that had spent 78 years being practical about difficult things. Maggie said $800,000. Yes, that is more money than I have ever had. I know, another silence. The foundation, Maggie said. Tell me. There are other people like me who were afraid, who didn't have someone to call, who didn't have 20 motorcycles show up in a parking lot. She paused. What happens to them? You tell me, Sloan said. The Margaret Harlan Foundation was incorporated in the state of Arizona in January, with Owen handling the legal structure pro bono, which he described as a professional obligation, and which everyone who knew him understood was something considerably more personal. Its mission was the advocacy, legal support, and security assistance of elderly Arizona residents subjected to financial harassment, physical intimidation, or targeted predation. It funded security upgrades at commercial properties. It maintained a referral network for legal services. It ran a hotline staffed by volunteers selected for the specific quality of understanding that distinguishes a system that absorbs calls from a system that actually helps. Initial funding $800,000. By the end of its first year, an additional $400,000 had arrived in donations from people across the country who had watched a video of an old woman standing straight in a parking lot in the rain and had decided that this was something they wanted to be part of. The Phoenix City Council held a ceremony in February. The room was full. Mayor, council members, press, cameras people. Sloan did not know who had apparently found their way there by following the story through its various public stages. Sterling Dutton and his team along the left wall in their suits. Owen near the back, standing because the seats were taken. Nate Forsyth in his new capacity. Sawyer Tatum in the fourth row, wearing his good shirt with the expression of a man who is not entirely certain he belongs somewhere, but has decided to stay. And in the front row, the 22 members of the Iron Road chapter in their leather, their collective presence filling that row, with something that was not quite ceremony and not quite guard duty, but was the precise combination of the two that the occasion seemed to require. Sloan sat in the second seat from the left. Her mother stood at the podium in the dark blue dress she had bought the previous week, standing the way she stood everywhere, which was the way of someone who has decided that the space she occupies is space she is entitled to occupy, and that any apology for this would be a form of dishonesty. The mayor gave her the Phoenix Civic Courage Award. She held it and looked at the room. She said, "I am not good at speeches. I want to say that at the beginning so that what follows makes sense in context." Laughter, warm and genuine, the laughter of people who have been in the presence of something real long enough to feel at ease around it. People hear the word courage, and they think it means not being afraid, she said. I understand why they think that. Strong people are not afraid. Brave people walk into danger without flinching. She paused. I was afraid for 6 weeks. Every Wednesday morning, driving to that parking lot, I was afraid. The last 2 weeks, I was afraid in my own home, which is a particular variety of fear I would not wish on anyone. She looked at the room. Courage is not the absence of fear. Anyone who has ever done anything genuinely difficult knows this. Courage is the decision that what you are afraid of is less important than what you are standing for. She looked at the front row, at Sloan. I called my daughter because I needed her, she said. And she came because that is who she is and that is who the people behind her are. They came not because of who I am to them. They came because of what was being done to me and because they are people who have spent their lives understanding that certain things when you see them are not optional to respond to. She looked back at the room. I am 78 years old. I have lived a long and mostly ordinary life, and I have been grateful for every part of it. I did not set out to stand for anything larger than myself. She paused. But here is what I have learned. When you refuse to be made smaller than you are, you give other people permission to do the same. And that permission travels farther than you can see from where you are standing. She held up the plaque. This is not mine, she said. This belongs to anyone who has ever been told to shut up and take it, and decided not to. The room rose. The applause had weight behind it, the force of people releasing something they had been holding, something that had been accumulating for weeks and months in response to a story that had moved through the country like water, finding its level, filling in the spaces where people recognized something familiar. Sloan sat in the front row and did not clap. She sat very still with her hands on her knees and looked at her mother at the podium in the blue dress holding the plaque facing the room with the complete presence of someone who has arrived at a moment larger than they expected and has chosen entirely to be in it. She thought about Dana, about the garage Dana had found, the sign Dana had painted, standing on a ladder in October sunlight, about spring which Dana had loved and which came every year without her now. She thought about Tommy Hale. She thought about the particular arc of a life that had taken her from a house in Mesa to 2 wars to a garage in Flagstaff to a parking lot in the rain, and she thought about how none of those things had felt connected while they were happening, but looked from here like a line that had always been heading somewhere specific. She had not known that when she picked up her keys. She had done it because it was a Tuesday night, and her mother had called, and she had heard something in her voice that she was not able to hear and remain where she was. That was all. That had been enough. A year passed with the particular density of time that is fully occupied, that has no empty spaces where attention drifts. Sloan finished the 1968 Harley Panhead she had promised its owner by Christmas and delivered it on December 21st, 2 days early, because some promises you keep ahead of schedule when the calendar gives you the opportunity. The foundation held its first benefit dinner in March, raised enough to expand the legal assistance program to Tucson and Flagstaff, in 3 other Arizona cities where the need had been documented and the infrastructure was ready. Officer Nate Forsyth made his first arrest under the Elder Protection and Dignity Act, a piece of legislation the Arizona State Legislature had passed in the previous session, which the bill's official text named as written, and which everyone in the relevant communities had spent several weeks calling Dorothy's Law before someone pointed out that the woman who had inspired it was alive and had opinions about being turned into eponymous without consultation, at which point everyone switched to calling it Margaret's Law before she asked them to stop, at which point everyone used the official name, which is what she had wanted from the beginning. Sterling Dutton was promoted within the Financial Crimes Unit. He sent Sloan a text when it happened. She sent back 2 words. Well deserved. The Walmart on the east side of Mesa underwent renovations in the fall. New lighting throughout the parking lot 3 times the previous intensity. New cameras mounted at angles that covered every section with no gaps. A security guard stationed at the main entrance during peak hours through a contract that included training protocols developed with the foundation's input. On a concrete pillar near the 3rd row from the western entrance, in the exact spot where a woman had parked every Wednesday for 15 years, and where three men had surrounded her on a rainy night, while the parking lot moved around them indifferent and unseeing, there was a small blue sign. Margaret Harlan Safety Zone. Protected 24 hours. Report concerns to store security. Ordinary, machine printed, the kind you would not notice if you were not looking for it. The woman it was named for noticed it every time she drove past the pillar, which was every Wednesday morning at 10, because her routine had not changed, because changing her routine would have been a form of letting the parking lot win, and she was not in the habit of letting parking lots win. On the first Wednesday of the following November, Maggie pulled into her usual spot, turned off the car, and sat for a moment before getting out. The morning was clear and cold by Arizona standards, the low 50s, the desert autumn air carrying the specific quality she had always found difficult to describe precisely, but had always recognized as her favorite time of year. The parking lot was quiet. A few other cars, a man loading bags into a minivan 3 rows east, a teenager collecting carts from the corral with the economical movements of someone who has found the optimal route and stopped thinking about it consciously. She got out of the car. She walked to the back, opened the trunk, retrieved her reusable bags, which she had been using since long before it was fashionable and intended to continue using for as long as she had occasion, to which she did not spend time thinking about. She walked toward the entrance. She passed the concrete pillar. She looked at the sign with her name on it. She had been looking at this sign every week for months and had not become accustomed to it the way she had expected to. She had expected the novelty to wear off. It had not. Not because she had an investment in the recognition. She had meant it when she said the award was not hers. She had meant it when she said she had simply refused to be quiet, and in refusing had given other people the vocabulary of refusal. It had not worn off because every time she looked at it, she thought about something slightly different. Some Wednesdays she thought about her husband, about the specific patience of him, the cheerful Saturday car washings. Some Wednesdays she thought about the months of being afraid and the particular cost of carrying fear quietly and alone for too long. Some Wednesdays she thought about the 8 other people the foundation had helped in the past year, whose names she knew, who she thought of with the care you give to people, whose specific pain you understand from the inside. Today she thought about her daughter. She thought about the sound of 20 motorcycles entering a parking lot from 4 directions on a rainy night, the silence when the engines cut off, the sound of boots on wet asphalt walking toward a situation that did not require walking toward it except in every sense that actually mattered. She stood in front of the sign. She allowed herself exactly as long as she wanted. Then she went to buy her groceries. At the checkout, the cashier, a young woman with her hair pulled back, looked up partway through, scanning the items. She said, "Are you?" and stopped herself with the self-consciousness of someone deciding whether the thing they are about to say belongs in this context. Maggie said yes. The cashier finished running the items. She put the last bag on the belt. She looked up again. She said, "My grandmother watched the video, the first one from the parking lot. She watched it maybe 20 times. A pause. She filed a report with the police the next week about something that had been happening to her for months. Someone was pressuring her about an old debt. She'd been paying it even though she wasn't sure she owed it because she was afraid of what would happen if she stopped. She handed over the receipt. They arrested him last spring. Grandmother got $4,000 back." Maggie looked at the young woman. She said, "What is your grandmother's name?" the cashier told her. Maggie said, "I'm going to remember that." She meant it. She pushed her cart to the exit and through the automatic doors and into the clear morning air. From somewhere across the flat landscape of Mesa, she heard the sound she had come to associate with a particular kind of safety. Not the safety that comes from the absence of danger, which is not something she counted on, absolutely. The safety of knowing that if she needed to make a call, the call would be answered. The sound of a motorcycle engine. She did not look for it. She did not need to. She loaded her bags into the trunk, closed it, walked around to the driver's side, got in. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The morning was clear and the parking lot was ordinary, and the sign on the pillar was visible in her rearview mirror, small and blue and specific. She started the car. She drove home. In a garage in Flagstaff, Sloan Harlan set a wrench down on a workbench and looked at the photograph on the wall. Her unit, Mosul. 12 people in desert sun, the Humvee behind them, the future unknown ahead of them. Tommy Hale at her right shoulder laughing at something outside the frame. She had looked at this photograph 10,000 times over 20 years. In grief and in guilt and in the specific quality of obligation that the living carry toward the dead who died alongside them, doing something. She had looked at it at 2 in the morning when sleep would not come, and at noon when the garage was full of sound and work, and at every hour between. She looked at it now, she said nothing. There was nothing left to say that had not been said, nothing owed that had not been paid, no accounting outstanding between herself and the laughing figure in the photograph. The account was settled. The promise had been kept in full. She picked up the wrench. She went back to work. The radio played low. Johnny Cash, the station. It had always been the voice that did not require anything from her and gave back something she had stopped trying to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. Outside, the desert was bright and enormous, and the sky went on in the way that Arizona skies go on without apology or visible horizon without any edge the eye could reach. A promise kept, the sun high, the road ahead clear, and somewhere in Mesa, a woman with white hair and 78 years and the posture of someone who has decided permanently against being made smaller than she is driving home through an ordinary and beautiful morning, thinking about a cashier's grandmother's name, which she had promised to remember. She would.